Mr. Festus Okoye, who is the INEC National Commissioner in charge of voter education and publicity. There are worrisome views being expressed that we are having excessive judicial intervention in electoral outcomes of our country. Is this the case?
Well, I think that we must establish the ground norm here, and that is that the judiciary, as it were, and the courts are part of the overall framework of the electoral process. So if we establish that, it now gives us a very clear view of the role the courts play, especially in electoral matters. Now, the courts are not self-activating. In other words, the courts will remain dormant unless somebody approaches the courts with a grievance. Within our electoral framework, we have segregated the role of the courts into two. One, we have the pre-election issues and then the post-election issues. Now, prior to this particular period, the courts have adopted the view that in relation to election matters, in relation to party processes, in relation to nominations, exclusive responsibility and priority of political parties to without whatsoever. Over the years, we have seen that rather than do that, some of the political parties are completely engaged in anti-democratic nomination processes. And that was why the National Assembly, in their wisdom, inserted Section 87 of the Electoral Act to say that before you can submit the list of and particulars of your nominated candidates to the electoral management body, you must have conducted valid party primaries. So, based on that, the National Assembly now imputed pre-election litigation into the constitutional framework and made it a constitutional matter. Now, the post-election litigation is a different ballgame. Now, I completely agree that those who conduct elections cannot be said to be perfect. The institutions are not perfect. So since mistakes are bound to be made, you also need an institution that can look at issues and say, look, in relation to this one, you didn't do what is right. And in relation to this one, you didn't do what is right. I think that what people are complaining about is that in a few instances, the courts have not done justice to the matter. But in relation to whether the courts are relevant, whether they are fundamental, and whether they are part of the overall electoral process, I believe that the courts play a very huge role as the guardian of the Constitution, and also to make sure that those who have been entrusted with the responsibility of this carry them out appropriately.
Contentious point where Ezenwa himself also said that the people who are supposed to be at the center of elections are being pushed to the periphery in the electoral process in terms of electoral outcomes, in the sense that their will no longer counts. But for the benefit of our viewers, we know, my colleague Kieran has also raised some of these points. We do know that in the lead up to the election, you have to have political parties, and then parties have to conduct their own elections, and there is a challenge with internal party democracy. So, which is why if I was unlawfully excluded from my party primaries, as a pre-election matter, I could then go to court. The election takes place, a winner is announced, and by the time I go through the judicial process, the court will now say, "Oh, Kingsley, yeah, you were the rightful candidate of this party, so you should be the winner." And of course, it's also possible that Okoye, I'm not saying, maybe Kirian himself was already doing a review, a rehearsal to review a parade at his inauguration. And suddenly they say, "Oh boy, you can't do that now. Kingsley, who is the winner?" So first of all,
and did not contest the election.
I didn't. Yes. So let's help our viewers to understand this before we get to that critical aspect of dealing with irregularities on voting day, and then the shenanigans that normally go on with collation and so on and so forth.
I think that this confusion, this uncomfortable confusion, arises as a result of what I call the convergence of pre- and post-election matters. When you have this convergence, it becomes uncomfortable. And sometimes we find it very, very difficult to segregate. This is because Section 285 of the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria has made it very clear that the courts have jurisdiction over pre-election matters. That these are issues that arose or have arisen as a result of either the conduct of congresses or political parties or the conduct of party primaries and so on. Now, unfortunately, at the lower level, the courts have 180 days to deal with that matter. The Court of Appeal has 60 days to deal with it, and the Supreme Court has 60 days to deal with it. The challenge is that sometimes before the courts finish with pre-election matters, we are already in post-election matters. And then somebody has been sworn in before the pre-election matter is determined. And when the pre-election matter is determined, and it goes against what has happened in the post-election matter, sometimes our people do not understand it. So I think that one of the things we need to do before I get to the other issue is to make sure that in the new electoral amendment that we are envisaging, that we make it very clear and we make it in such a way that all pre-election matters are determined and decided before election. This is because when the courts go ahead to say, oh, a political party did not have a candidate going into the election, all the people that went to go and vote, their votes are wasted and their votes will not count. Sometimes our people do not understand it, but that is the law. Because Section 85 of the Electoral Act, 2010 as amended, makes it very clear that one, you must conduct valid party primaries. Two, both the Constitution and the Electoral Act also give the electoral management body the right to bring out a timetable for the conduct of elections and the conduct of party primaries. So if a timetable says party primaries must be conducted on a particular day, and that day passes, you have not conducted their party primaries, you can no longer submit a list of candidates. So even if you go and get an injunction and then you submit, at the end of the day, the apex court may say you didn't have a candidate in the election. Or there are also situations where people submit their affidavits, the list of their candidates and the affidavits. And people who are on that list are not even qualified to be on the list. Or they are underage. Or they are not even Nigerians. Because, for instance, the Constitution says that for you to become President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria or a governor, you must be a Nigerian by birth. So if a political party submits the name of somebody who is not a Nigerian by birth, and it's a pre-election matter, and then it goes to the apex court, and by then the person has won the election, there's nothing the court can do. So I think that it is this uncomfortable convergence of pre- and post-election matters that creates some of these challenges. But on the other issue, I think that we need to look at each case from its own dynamics, from its own merit, and from what was submitted to the courts for adjudication. If somebody has gone to court to say, look, I want majority of lawful votes, this is the evidence. These are the Form EC8A, which are the results from the polling units. In the calculation of the results, the returning officer added 5,000 votes to my opponent and decreased my votes by 5,000. This is the evidence. The courts are bound to look at it, and if the courts are satisfied that you want majority of lawful votes, it is inconceivable for the courts to go and say, despite the fact that you want majority of lawful votes, go back to the polls. That will be rewarding bad behavior on the part of the political party that engage in the irregularity. So I agree that the votes of the people, as expressed through at the ballot, should be the major determinant of who gets elected and who does not get elected. But those votes and that determination must also be based on both the Constitution and the law. So if you do not have a candidate going into the election, and then people go and vote for you, their votes are wasted, unfortunately. So these are the issues we need to put in perspective. But in certain circumstances, some of our courts have delivered judgments that that you cannot understand. But these are exceptions to the rule. But in the main, I agree that the courts must be strengthened, the courts must continue to play the roles they're playing, and that we must also find ways and means of building the capacity of those who administer justice, because the electoral process keeps evolving and is very, very dynamic. The laws keep on changing almost on a daily basis, and there are international standards that need to be followed. So we must continue to build the capacity of judicial officers that adjudicate in electoral matters.
The Constitution has vested INEC with independence. It is Independent National Electoral Commission. How is it independent if its activities can easily be changed, not just oversighted? Nobody is saying that the courts should not oversight. I am not saying that the courts should not oversight. They have that constitutional power to do so. But they shouldn't substitute their own judgment, their own declaration of winner in place of the declaration made by the body that is constitutionally vested with that responsibility. The Constitution, there is nowhere in the Constitution that vests on the judiciary the power to declare winners of election, from Section 1 to Section 320 of the Constitution. There's no such provision. But there are provisions in the Constitution that vest INEC with power to declare, to organize, supervise, and declare results of election. And it is my view that it is not intended that that power should be shared between INEC and any other authority or organ of government. And if this continues, my fear, because when problems start, they start gradually and they degenerate. Like the last time I was here, we talked about banditry. It started as a little thing in one small part of the country, but now it has taken over the whole country. This judiciary declaring people winners of election that they didn't even participate in started gradually with one case. Now it is becoming pervasive, and Commissioner Festus Festus Okoye has himself said that some of the decisions are worrisome. Justice Bodero's rival, who just retired from the Supreme Court, has himself said some of the decisions of the Supreme Court don't make sense to him anymore these days. So we shouldn't allow a situation where, for instance, INEC in a presidential election will declare Mr. A winner of that election, and the court will say, no, it's Mr. B that won that election. Can we imagine the chaos that we are going to have in this country? It's easy to say one governor remove him and put another person. If that happens in the case of a presidential election, there will be calamity in this country. And we should now take proactive steps in this process of amending the Electoral Act and the Constitution to avert that eventuality. Because, as they say, Murphy's Law is that whatever can go wrong will sooner or later go wrong. It's just a matter of time.
Professor Osumbo, we are going on a short break, but I don't want us to lose the trend of your thoughts so that you address this question along with it. Yes, you have acknowledged that the judiciary has a constitutionally mandated role to oversight INEC, that even in its independence. But isn't it also the duty in that oversight of the judiciary to indicate, as part of its review, whether INEC has in fact complied with the rules that is set for itself and the rules established by the Constitution? And where it has not complied with those rules and regulations or provisions of the Constitution, to say, this is what you ought to do. And assuming, Commissioner Okoye mentioned this, that somebody else had finangled with the process, instead of the courts to now say, no, what INEC you did was wrong, this is what you ought to have done, and therefore this is the winner of the election, go back to the field as you appear to be suggesting, that would be rewarding bad behavior.
Whose behavior?
Bad behavior.
On whose part?
Of an agent of
because
INEC.
He started
of
by...
an agent of INEC.
Who is being rewarded, the agent of INEC or the candidate?
Of course, in favor of the candidate who has benefited from.
Because the proposal that I have made is that in that decision by the court, he can say, no, the INEC officer was guilty of certain malpractices, didn't comply with the law, and can recommend him for prosecution. And I also propose that even the National Assembly, acting on a 2/3 majority, can remove either a commissioner or the national chairman or rec who was guilty of that malpractice. So there are a number of checks that you can introduce into the process. And Commissioner Festus Okoye also mentioned something, that the institution of INEC is not perfect. And I would go further to say there's no institution of government that is perfect.
In the courts.
Including the executive, the legislature, or the judiciary. So if things can go wrong with INEC, and they can go wrong with the executive, they can go wrong with the legislature, they can also go wrong with the judiciary.